Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia. I hope everyone's having a great holiday season as 2020 is finally ending. Here on the channel, we're going to be celebrating this with a 12-day of Christmas special series featuring 12 top 5 lists relating to the game Total War 3 Kingdoms. And to kick off this series today, we're going to be going over the top 5 new DLCs that I want to see. But first things first, it's always nice to take a look back at the DLCs that has been released. And if we take out the Blood and Gore DLC, which really shouldn't count, there are 4 major DLCs for Total War 3 Kingdoms in the span of the last year and a half since the release of the game. And they are the 8 Princes, Mandate of Heaven, A World Betrayed, and The Furious Wild. And the first 3 of these are chapter packs, or new starting dates for the base game, while the last one is an expansion pack. And going forward, we should expect a mix of chapter packs and expansion packs, as CA has already stated in their development blog that the next DLC will be a chapter pack, and that later on in 2021, a northern expansion pack is also being planned. So here for our list, I am going to be listing my top 5 DLCs in the order that I expect to see them released. I will also include my estimates of their release dates, introduce their historical backdrop, especially for some of the chapter packs, and some of the game mechanics that I want to see included with some of them. And at the end of the video, I'll also be throwing in some bonus DLCs that I want to see added beyond these next 5 that I'm expecting here for this list, as I hope there will be more than 5 DLCs in store for Total War 3 Kingdom. So let's get started with the very first DLC on my list, which will feature the Battle of Guandu. So as you see here, we have Battle of Guandu as a chapter pack, or at least I'm predicting it to be a chapter pack. It should be featured somewhere around the autumn season of year 200. Now this is the starting date of the actual battle itself, and oftentimes we'll see that CA will move this timeline forward a little bit before this date, so that we can set up the actual conflict in game. But I don't think it's going to be too much forward. There was about an 8-turn gap, or about a year and a half, for the Mandate of Heaven, as in the preset date before the actual Yellow Turban Rebellion. We might see a little bit of leeway here. There's some concerns where I think some factions might not get included, but we'll cover that real quick once we jump into the game map. And I think this is going to be released as the next DLC, because it just makes logical sense for them to continue the timeline without making too big of a jump. That way we can introduce all the necessary legendary characters by factions before the faction actually gets wiped out in history. So if we hop into the game and take a look at the 194 map, which will be the closest chapter pack point to this Battle of Guandu, what we can expect to see for this conflict is a showdown between Cao Cao and Yuan Shao. So we have Cao Cao selected here. In 194, he has this stretch of land. By around 200, he will have a bit more of the central plains. And you see that Yuan Shao has the north in 194, but what you don't see here is that he actually has some vassals during this period. So the game has his son, Yuan Tan, set up in what's called Qingzhou, or this area right here to the west of Kongrong. And he has also another vassal, I believe, in Gaogan, to his west. And at this time, his main conflict is still with Gongsun Zan, who by this start in Battle of Guandu should be dead. So Gongsun Zan's faction should be no more, and that includes Gongsun Zan's vassal. I think Tian Kai was his vassal in this scenario, and this entire north should be relatively united under Yuan Shao. Now there is still Gongsun Du in the corner. It's not related to Gongsun Zan, but he still holds the Liaodong region. So not the entire north, and the bandits of the Black Mountains are still alive during this period and in a conflict with Yuan Shao at the same time, but most of the north should be united under Yuan Shao's banner. And the Battle of Guandu itself takes place, if we're using the game map, probably somewhere around here. It's an invasion by Yuan Shao into Cao Cao's territory, and Cao Cao held it as a defensive position and eventually overcame very great odds to beat Yuan Shao. and eventually fracture Yuan Shao's growing kingdom, as Yuan Shao would die of depression shortly after, and his 4 sons technically would split his land, and they would fall one by one to Cao Cao as they had plenty of infighting. So that's kind of the backdrop of this period, but there's a couple of key things in terms of other factions. So when we have the world betrayed, the featured factions are Sun Ce and Lü Bu. Both of these characters should be dead by the start of Battle of Guandu. And I think they should be gone from the game when we see the next chapter pack. Or else, there will be no incentive for players to purchase a World Betrayed. Because if you can play their mechanics on a different DLC, then why would you buy a World Betrayed? That's my line of thought. And it makes sense historically to make this jump from 194 to, let's say, 199 or 200 if they want a nice round number, maybe spring of 200. Then we'll have the deaths of Sun Ce, and as well as Cao Cao's defeat of Lü Bu. And at that time, you also have a couple interesting scenarios with the other factions in this area, as Liu Bei would be absorbed by Cao Cao. Liu Bei would work with Cao Cao to eliminate Lü Bu, and then return with Cao Cao to court, as Cao Cao now is the prime minister of the Han Empire, and Liu Bei is joining with the Han Empire and gets acknowledged by the emperor himself as his uncle. And then Liu Bei's forces would also be scattered, as he will betray Cao Cao. So maybe Liu Chui's betrayal would be kind of the center point, because Liu Bei would return to this area and take over one of the commanderies and kind of declare himself semi-independent from Cao Cao. And then Cao Cao will come and crush Liu Bei, dividing Liu Bei's forces, where Guanyu would join Cao Cao temporarily, and Liu Bei would escape north to join Yuan Shao. And then the 3 brothers will reunite, and they head down south to meet up with Liu Biao. So Liu Bei's journey is going to get very turbulent around this time, and depending on what exact start date they will pick, Liu Bei will likely be a vassal either to Cao Cao or to Yuan Shao, which will be quite interesting. And you might be missing a few of your brothers, and you have to kind of get them back. And playing as Cao Cao or Yuan Shao would be extra rewarding. Yuan Shao would have a huge empire in the north, hopefully with many of his sons splitting the land, because Yuan Xi would get Youzhou, which is what Gong Sun had, and Yuan Tan would be given Qingzhou, where he is invading into Kong Rong's territory. And then his favorite son would be with him. Yuan Shang would be still in this area. And he still probably would have Gao Gan, which is his nephew, out west, doing battle perhaps with the Black Mountain Bandits led by Zhang Yan. To the farther south, we'll probably see Sun Ce's death. There will be probably a semi-big faction that's owned by Sun Quan now, I'm assuming. Sun Quan would either be a very young lord or perhaps a regent transition. Maybe we'll see Sun Quan's faction get a unique mechanic, because if they're going to kill off Sun Ce, then Sun Quan's going to need a unique mechanic. And maybe they'll introduce more bandits down south and maybe cover some of this land up. Because after Sun Ce's death, there was rebellions across the board where you had different bandit groups, not necessarily Yan Baihu, as he was killed by Sun Ce already at this point. So that's also going to be a very awkward existence. Maybe they can find a few more bandits to lead, or make Huangzu a little bit stronger, as Huangzu would be a central force in the defense against Sun Quan in this area, and Sun Quan would revenge for his father and kill off Huangzu eventually. So maybe we'll have some sort of conflict between Liu Biao and Sun Quan's faction, but Sun Quan pretty much did not go north. Also, along the dead would be Yuan Shu, as Cao Cao would gain control of most of this region known as Xuzhou. So that's pretty much the picture here for the Guandu campaign. It'd be largely centered around a conflict in the north and some small conflict in the south around the Yangtze River. As for the rest of the map, Liu Biao would still be alive, the Nanman factions would still be alive, Shi Xie would still be alive, Ma Teng would still be alive, and a lot of other lords would die. So perhaps we'll see some new ones added in as well. So that's the hope for Guandu. And the main changes is probably Lü Bu and Sun Ce saying goodbye to us. Now, could the game include them? Maybe the last stand for Lü Bu and alt history for Sun Ce? Maybe. But my guess is they probably stay away from that, just so that there's some distinction between A World Betrayed and, say, the next DLC, whatever name they decide to pick for it. So that's what's coming up next, or at least that's what I expect to be coming up next. All these top 5 lists here are based on my opinion and my hopes for the game, not necessarily what will actually happen, but we'll see very soon. I expect this next DLC, whatever it turns out to be, to drop somewhere around late January or early February, around the Chinese New Year mark. This year's Chinese New Year is a little bit late. We have it around February 12th. So around that date, we should see the DLC being released, and we'll find out what exactly it is. And moving on, the next DLC after that, and the second one on our list, I expect to be the Northern expansion, which really is no surprise. This one's pretty much announced and almost guaranteed. When they pushed out the first expansion pack with the Furious Wild, where the South got expanded, they pretty much said that they're going to do the same thing for the North in the later half of the 2021. So I'm putting it as a summer release date, maybe late summer, early fall. We'll see exactly where it falls in, but it's pretty much in the works because they acknowledge a lot of the issues with the mountains being misplaced, changing some of the gate locations, and perhaps some more map expansion in the north. So if we jump back into the same map that we had before, we're still going to use the 194 and we're still going to use Tal because it doesn't really matter here for the expansion pack because we're not going to get a new date. What we will get is a change to all previous dates. So some people after the Furious Wild think that perhaps the next DLC is going to be the Northern expansion. I don't think so because they pretty much said they're going to do a chapter pack in between, and I prefer it this way because if you think about it, expansion packs will alter all the previous chapter packs. So it makes sense to set up this conflict that mainly features the North and then add in stuff. Similar to we had A World Betrayed, which is a conflict that mainly featured the South, and then they added the Southern expansion, which made the South a little bit richer in terms of the number of characters that's here. So they'll do something similar. They'll feature, a couple of faction leaders that will get either a revamped mechanic or maybe a new leader with some very cool mechanic, similar to how they sold the game on Lu Bu and Sun Ce's gameplay. And then they'll flush out the region in the north with this expansion pack. And what exactly can they do with Northern expansion pack? Well, there's a couple of things they could do. One, add new subcultures, which they already done with the Furious Wild. You had the Southern tribes, or technically the Nanman people, added in. Now you can do Northern nomads, and there's a bunch of them. The game already features cavalry units from the Xiongnu tribes, which would be this entire region here. And then you have the Wu Huan, who did battle with Cao Cao after the conflict of Guandu. So that would fall in pretty nicely, and they would be the central region here. And then over here in Liaodong and Liaoxi, you have the Xianbei, which will be a huge player in later periods of Chinese history. And you already have some Xianbei last names in the game. Tuoba clan is Xianbei, and you'll see many of these more famous tribal chiefs perhaps being added in as factions. I don't know how the map will feature them or the game mechanic. It's up in the air. If they're going to be playable factions, I think they need some mechanic similar to the Nanman factions where their goal is not to become, an empire or 3 kingdoms, because that would not make sense for them. They will probably play some sort of nomadic raiding mechanic. That would make more sense. Or you add more gates in the north to give some of these northern factions something to do across all timelines, because you can imagine if you're playing as Gong Sun Zan, you hug the corner, very, very safe development, perhaps in 190 campaign. Now, if they add some nomads to the north, you're going to be pretty busy holding off them. And that's kind of what his job was in history. White Horse Fellows were known to do battle with the Xianbei tribes. So that's kind of what we're going to head towards with the next expansion pack, and definitely a new map update. They'll probably change some of the mountain locations to make things more correct. They might even change some of the commandery structure. We saw quite a big change with patch 1.6. I expect more changes headed forward because a lot of the commanderies are still a little misrepresented. Maybe we'll see that fixed in the future. And then moving on, we get a very exciting one, at least the one that I'm really anticipating, and that will be the one centered around the Battle of Chibi and be number 3 on our list. And this one features a conflict that takes place in the winter season of 208. Now, Chibi is very well known even in the West. Some people might know as Red Cliff, which would be the direct translation. And in the game, they already added the location in. So if we hop back into the map, we see that Changsha would be this region right here. And if we switch over to, let's say, 190 Sunjian, and Sunjian's faction would start out here in Changsha, and this trade port has been given the name of Chibi. So Chibi is in the game, and the conflict that happens around here in 208 will eventually shape the formation of Three Kingdoms. So it's a very pivotal battle. And at this time, we already have Cao Cao defeating Yuan Shao. And he already defeated everyone else too. He has united pretty much the Central Plains as well as the North. Zhang Yan is now a general under Cao Cao, so perhaps he's a vassal in the North. Ma Teng is also an officer working for Cao Cao in Ye. Ma Chao takes over out west, so that's a key development. So technically, Cao Cao would have everything Dong Zhuo has. Chang'an's retaken, Luoyang's retaken, Xuzhou's peaceful, Kong Rong's also working in the courts. All of this area is taken over. So Cao Cao would have everything. He would be what you have as an emperor in, let's say, 182, right? Liu Hong is the emperor. He has pretty much the whole map, but doesn't mean he owns everything. You have subjects. And I think when they introduce this subject mechanic here in the game with Liu Hong, then we're going to see this more and more in the future as these kingdoms get bigger. You can't have a faction that owns half the map at the start of the game. It wouldn't be fun to play as the faction or against the faction. So what they have to do is probably something similar to this, where they divide up the land to other playable factions that would simply start out as subjects under that main faction. But if you want to play as the main faction, you still can. And they can take land from their subjects and also manage the kingdom. And that could be pretty interesting. But that will only really apply to Cao Cao in this case, if we do a Chibi faction, as the South and Liu Bei are not so lucky. So if we fly back to Sun Jian's map in 190, let's say, then what we have is the North and the Central Plain controlled by Cao Cao, even parts of the West. Ma Chao would technically be a vassal, and Ma Teng would be someone in Cao Cao's court, or maybe the game will make him dead. I don't know how they will apply that. But regardless, Liu Bao is on his last breath. I don't know if they'll introduce a conflict where Liu Bao's already dead or Liu Bao's still alive, but he's about to die of old age. And his inheritance is going to be a big issue here as Cao Cao is trying to march south. Because you imagine he has most of the West, North, and Central Plains controlled. And if he goes south, he unites China and it's game over. There will be no Three Kingdoms. So he's making that attempt. And as he's coming down, Liu Biao and the Jin province, which is huge, which is his entire region here, stands in his way, as well as the rest of the south controlled by Sun Quan. Liu Bei is just one county holding right here. Liu Biao pretty much took Liu Bei in, gave him a county, told him to defend it. And Liu Bei is trying to build up his force there. And Cao Cao is coming crushing down, and Liu Biao dies of old age. His son surrenders. Liu Bei is stuck. Liu Bei runs south, meets up with Sun Quan. They form an alliance. They hold Cao Cao at Chibi, defeats his navy and defeats his army, chases him back. The Jin province is split between northern half and southern half, and the southern half becomes semi-independent, and the northern half is held by Cao Ren, Cao Cao's cousin. And then the conflict from there is the fracturing of Sun Quan and Liu Bei's alliance as they compete for these land that are now up for grab. And in the end, Liu Bei ended up recovering most of the southern pieces and some of the northern pieces, which he eventually traded away, or pieces of it away back to Sun Quan. And he kept a few. He kept a few key ones around Xiangyang, and this will be Jiangling region. And then he started going out west. And then as we can see from that, Liu Bei would form what would eventually become Shu Han, or technically in his mind Han, but this is the Shu region, and historically he's known as Shu. And then down here, we have eventually what become Wu, right? Sun Quan's faction. And then everything else would be Cao Cao with Wei. And that's where things become a little hazy, because if we continue from 208 and have the development of a chapter pack where we can play the formation of the three kingdoms, which would be quite exciting for Liu Bei in particular, because you're entering the Shu region. You'll be doing battle with the likes of Liu Zhang in this region. And then this is also when Ma Chao was now defeated and working with Zhang Lu in the same area. And eventually he decides to split off and join Liu Bei. And that's pretty exciting all over the west and the central part here. The rest of the map will be Cao Cao's defeat and then Ma Chao's rebellion against him, invasion into Chang'an, where he just lost in the south, have to go back and save it. So there's plenty of space to work with things, and he would still probably be in his empire state that we talked about, so perhaps more scattered, as he has to set up vassals to defend his, or subjects defend various parts of land. Perhaps Hao Ren would get his own model, would have his own region here guarding the rest of the Jin province. You can play as him to defend that area. You have Zhang Liao defending the area of Huainan over here. The famous battle of Hefei will take place, or at least the first attempt of Hefei will take place in this time period. So you have some empire mechanic at play. And then Xia Huoyuan will be out west. So many of his famous generals will probably end up with their own area to defend, and you can probably play as them, or hopefully, I hope you can play as them. And that way you have more exciting factions as you move down the time period, because you have less and less well-known warlords, and you have to rely on fracturing some of these big kingdoms to make things interesting. So moving back, if we go to our fourth DLC, I think after the Battle of Tribute, of course, there's multiple conflict in between, but I think we can jump straight to 220 and have an actual Three Kingdoms chapter pack. And this is something most Three Kingdoms game do not feature very much, because many people associate Three Kingdoms with the likes of Cao Cao, Liu Bei, and Sun Jian, perhaps. You have the early periods. You have the conflict with old turbans. You have the conflict with Dong Zhuo. But by the time it's 30 years in, you finally actually have the Three Kingdoms. And it doesn't happen until 220. And what happens during 220, or the winter of 220 here, is Cao Cao is dead. Cao Cao just passed away. And Cao Pi declares himself as emperor. And that kicked off a series of events where the Han Emperor is now no more. So without an actual Han Emperor, Liu Bei feels possible, I guess, to declare himself as an emperor. Because if the Han Emperor is still alive and Liu Bei does this, he's kind of usurping the throne. But if Cao Pi has already, abdicated or forced the Han Empire to abdicate, then Liu Bei is sort of continuing the Han. So you have Liu Bei declaring himself as emperor, and then down south as the final piece, Sun Quan eventually will also declare himself the emperor. And during this chapter pack, we'll probably get some betrayals. And if we jump back to the same map, we're still going to be centered around the Jin province region. We mentioned last time when we talked about the Battle of Tribute that Liu Bei will eventually hold on to most of this land, and he's going to leave Guanyu in defense of this region. So that's why we probably have a new emperor or empire mechanic for Liu Bei, as well as Sun Quan, where Liu Bei would be here as a faction, and then Guanyu perhaps is in the Jin province as his subject, similar to what we described for Cao Cao. And then we can see Guanyu get betrayed by Sun Quan on the back as he's invading north, get cut off, get defeated and killed, triggers Liu Bei to come to invade them, and we have Liu Bei's fall at the Battle of Yilian, and then all his army burned away, falls back to Baidicheng, which will be probably somewhere right here. I don't know how they will take care of that, but then he's going to die, and that's going to herald in a new generation of leaders. So we're going to have Liu Shan over here in the west, Sun Quan still here. So Sun Quan will probably get his mechanic first of the 3 second generation, just because Sun Ce and Sun Jian died so early. And then Cao Pi is going to be starting out in this one. So Cao Pi is going to have his new unique mechanic, and we probably see the same empire structure, perhaps the introduction of strategists like Sima Yi with their own subject land, so that eventually you might be able to play as Sima Yi to usurp the kingdom of Wei. So that's probably some of the options we'll see here for this setup, and we can play out many of the later generation characters, as many of the first generation characters will fall, right? We see Guan Yu's death. We're going to see a lot of other generals that have models right now in 190 eventually die of battle or old age by 220, and then we're going to have new and younger characters get added in. So once we get those added in, if we jump back to, let's say, a base game campaign in 190, man, you play that for a few turns. By the time you get to maybe just close to 200, not too crazy, right? You're not going to go 220. Let's say we go to 200. You can see some of these younger generation generals start spawning into the correct pools at 18 years old, and you have a bunch of non-generic champions or characters to use throughout your campaign as the age fades out. Or else right now, many players are relying on the timeless mode to make sure all their old generals stay alive during their entire campaign, especially if they go at a slower pace. But if we have this younger generation get introduced slowly, assuming we go in chronological order with these future DLCs, we'll probably get this solved. And this one, I think we'll probably won't see next year. As you can see, the date I have predicted for it is around spring of 2022. That's probably even a bit optimistic, as if they push out Battle Tribute during the winter. I don't know what defines winter. Perhaps Chinese New Year again would define winter, and that would be in 2022. So this is pushing it. It will be very ambitious. We get 2 chapter pack back to back, but then again, Mandate of Heaven and World Betrayed happened quite quickly. So finally, going back to our list, the 5th and final DLC that's going to be listed here today is going to be one that features the conflict between Zhuge Liang and Sima Yi. And this technically is the Northern Expedition. And that's when Zhuge Liang has pretty much firm control over the government of Shu after Liu Bei's death. Not in a bad way. Liu Bei left him to be the prime minister, and Liu Bei's son Liu Shan was very trusting of this uncle figure. And Sima Yi was, on the other hand, given some military post around this period. Before this period, Sima Yi was not a military general. He was a court politician, and he was given some roles to help hold back Zhuge Liang. And Zhuge Liang would eventually launch about 5 northern expeditions. So if we jump back in the game here, we mentioned how when the Furious Wall was released, this was the southern expedition where Zhuge Liang's army went south to end this rebellion. And the reason why he had to do that is because he needed this resource here. There's horses here and iron and all sorts of stuff. And he needed them to not rebel so that his army can focus on breaching the northern mountain ranges to attack places like Chang'an, to invade into Cao Cao's territory. Because if you see the ring of mountain here, it's not very easy to get out of the Shuba region. And previously, they had the route here secured because Guanyu was holding the Jin province, so they could launch an easy attack through the central plains. Look, all these mountains, very difficult to march armies through, and naval travel is not very developed either. So it's not efficient to, say, have a supply line from here all the way to here through this naval route just to attack Cao Cao. So the only feasible thing for the Shu kingdom at this time to do, now that the Jin province is lost, is that they have to get through this mountain pass here. There's about 3 mountain passes that were kind of well constructed that allow passage for them to launch their force out into Chang'an region. If they can take the Chang'an region from the Hanzhong region here, they have kind of a choke here where they could launch attack into the central plains. It took Zhuge Liang 5 tries. It ended in failure, and Zhuge Liang eventually died of old age or sickness, or probably just too tired carrying this entire kingdom on his back. But regardless, this is a very famous conflict in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and it's pretty much a highlight, as you have the 2 most well-known strategists during this period dueling it out against each other. And that's probably what we will see in this one. Now, of course, the rest of the map is still happening. You still have Cao Pi as emperor, and you still have, perhaps other subjects. They're still at war with the other kingdom. Sun Quan's not forgotten. Sun Quan goes on to live fairly long. So Sun Quan's going to be in control of the south for a long time. Sun Quan's interested in finding the island of Taiwan, which was Yizhou during the time. So he will launch some naval expeditions. He tried to work with Gongsun Du during this period to maybe find an ally in the north. And that was very silly. He took his money, killed off his envoy, and then basically went to Cao Pi and be like, see, I killed them and tricked them. So silly Sun Quan. But anyways, he will also launch other attacks against Hefei, trying to invade into Cao Cao's territory. So the rest of the map is still fairly busy. I'm not sure if the southern tribe would still play a role. I guess they could, because Meng Huo didn't die. He was given, a position to rule his land, and they could still be here as a vassal to the kingdom of Shu, perhaps, and they could maybe work their way in the conflict with Shi Xie. Because for some of these characters, the good thing is Shi Xie lived till he was 90, so he's always going to be here, and these guys were really young in 190, and they don't really enter the history books until like 223, so they'll still be fresh down south. You might just have a bit more color down south if you add some of the subjects where you could split off some of Sun Quan's people to kind of push the border here. Like Lu Xun could be introduced during this period as the general that's kind of holding this choke, and there's a series of conflict between them and Cao Pi's forces as well. So that's going to be probably what we will see if we see the game develop in a chronological order. And I think the pipeline is at least good till here. And if we hop back to our DLC timeline, I think we can add in another little special mention box. And this one are a couple things that I could potentially see the game developers do, but probably not related to the base game. One is they could end the timeline with a rise of the Jin, which would carry us from the end of the Three Kingdom conflict into the Eight Princes. It would be a nice transition. Now, this would probably be about Sima Yi's kids, not Sima Yi himself, as Sima Yi did push for a coup, but he never really took over when he was still alive. He's already very old, and his coup was more of a self-preservation move. It did guarantee the Sima clan incredible amount of power, and that eventually allowed Sima Shi and Sima Zhao, his two sons, to take over. And we can probably see that conflict perhaps in a DLC, where you have the Jin formed, and when Jin was formed, you still had, remnants of Shu, and you have remnants of Wu still on the map. It didn't unite until 268. So there's a lot of leeways if you want to do something where the Jin's coup is complete, and then the Jin pushes for unification, and then that DLC would lead into eventually 8 princes, and you have more characters for 8 princes as you have some of the earlier Jin generals added in. Then finally, I think everyone's favorite is character creator, and this would be kind of a custom faction that you make yourself. And I think this feature can also be really good if they make this a DLC and then implement the tools that they built for this for the children of legendary generals. Because right now, when you have legendary generals marry and have kids, they're all generic, which is a bit lame. So if you could have some influence over your kids, they don't need like awesome art, but some unique art and some traits for you to pick so that you can kind of build your kid or at least educate them in a sense. It'll be a lot of fun, and that could probably be added in with some tool like character creator, and that would also sell really well for DLC. I'm sure a lot of people would want to build their own kingdom and start things from 190 just to change history. So that's the idea. And finally, since the asset of the game is based on China and they have all the commandery set up, and like I said before, when they first made the 8 princes where they jump 100 years, what they easily could do is take the same map asset, take some of the troops that they have, the weapon Ji, they're all made. Just go back 400 years. I know it sounds like a lot, but to the beginning of the Han Dynasty. You have a very similar map. You have multiple factions as the end of the Qin Dynasty, the one before, fracture the land. You had so many warlords pop up, rebellions. You have the Chu Han contention, which will either see you play as Liu Bang, as he tried to form the Han Dynasty, or you can play as Chu Bawang, Xiang Yu, which you have the blade of Xiang Yu from Dong Zhuo. So there's a lot of items that even carry over from that period. You have blade of Xiang Yu. You also have like the King's Ge, which I know it's a jade item. You rarely see it in the game. And then you have a bunch of chariots that you probably see in combat, which is not in Three Kingdom, but definitely a key component of warfare during the Chu Han contention. You can also see that. And you can see other small kingdoms, not just between Chu and Han. There's also, Yan. When Chu kind of took over early on, they used the feudalism system that was popular during the spring-autumn, and they issued out a lot of land. And that kind of did them in, but that kind of is what you could go for. You could still get a very rich map with multiple factions. However, I don't think True Han Contention will be a DLC for Total War 3 Kingdom. It might be a saga project for the franchise as a whole, because you have like Fall of the Samurai as a separate saga project, or is it Rise of Samurai? I know they made one of them a saga game, and it used to be a DLC for the base game, but it uses the same assets, but has nothing to do with the base game. It's not like a chapter pack or expansion pack. So if they do something like the True Han Contention, I think it'll be more of like a separate saga standalone title that just shares some of the base game asset of the game. It wouldn't be very hard to develop, in my opinion. You use many of the existing asset and engines, but it'd be a cool idea to do. So that's it for our top 5 DLC I want to see episode. Come back tomorrow. We'll talk about free LCs. And that will kind of correspond with some of these timelines. And we'll talk about some of the noteworthy characters that you can expect to be added into the game for free. And we can see them join us in the 190 campaign if you only own the base game. Because the good thing about the game is, even though there could be a lot of potential exciting DLCs that will be added, you know for a fact that CA is going to be implementing many of the major changes as part of the free patch, and you get to enjoy all these changes as the game is developed. Because the map change that technically came with the Furious Wild, Southern Expansion, new tribes, subcultures, they're all provided for free for everyone, even if you don't own the Furious Wild. So expect that in the future, and we'll come back tomorrow and talk about free LCs. Until then, bye!